I want you to picture something for me. You're 71 years old, sitting at your son's dining room table in Minneapolis, and there's a document in front of you. Not a brochure this time, not a slideshow, an actual legal document, printed on heavy paper, with a place for your signature at the bottom. It's called a durable power of attorney. Your son explains it very calmly, the way you'd explain something to a person you've already decided can't quite follow complicated things anymore. It just means if something happens, Mom, we can make decisions for you without a court battle. It protects you. Your daughter-in-law nods along. Your son slides a pen across the table. And you sit there, 71 years old, fully capable of driving yourself home, fully capable of doing your own taxes and reading your own mail and forming your own opinions about the news. And you understand, with a clarity that feels like cold water, that what's actually being handed to you is not protection. It's a vote of no confidence, notarized. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 71 years old. And 11 months ago, my 2 adult children sat me down at that table and asked me to sign away my own decision-making, framed as an act of love. I did not sign it. 6 weeks later, I sold the house I'd lived in for 38 years, and I moved to a small city on an island in the Philippines that most of my family had never heard of and still, if I'm honest, cannot reliably find on a map. I want to tell you how that happened. I want to tell you about the year that followed, including 3 of the ugliest weeks of my adult life, when my own children tried to use the very document I refused to sign as a weapon to bring me home. And I want to tell you what I understand now, at 72, about the difference between being loved and being managed. I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, and I spent most of my working life as a high school English teacher, 31 years at the same school, which is either a remarkable display of loyalty or a remarkable lack of imagination, depending on which of my former colleagues you ask. I married Robert Whitfield when I was 26. He was an engineer for a company that made agricultural equipment, steady work, the kind of career where you know your pension to the penny 15 years before you retire. We had 2 children, my son David, and my daughter Amanda, and we built a life in a craftsman-style house in Duluth, with a porch that looked out over a garden Robert tended obsessively for 40 years. Robert died 4 years ago. A stroke, sudden, no long goodbye, no 18 months of hospital visits to prepare me for it. One Tuesday he was pruning the hydrangeas, and by Tuesday evening he was gone, and I want to tell you that a sudden death is somehow easier than a slow one, and I do not believe that is true. It simply trades one kind of unbearable for another. There's no version where losing someone you built 4 decades with comes out gentle. The first year, I functioned the way you're supposed to function. I went to the grief group at my church. I let David and Amanda check on me constantly, which felt, at first, like the correct and comforting response to loss. But something shifted around the 18-month mark, something I didn't have language for initially. David started calling not just to check in, but to ask increasingly specific questions. Had I paid the property taxes? Had I gotten the roof inspected? Was I still comfortable driving in winter? Had I thought about whether the house was too much house for one person? Amanda, who lived closer, in Steet. Paul started dropping by unannounced with a frequency that gradually stopped feeling like visiting and started feeling like inspection. She'd open my refrigerator while we talked, not obviously, but I noticed. She'd glance at my pill organizer on the counter. Once, she picked up my checkbook register, flipping through it, and said, "Mom, this looks a little disorganized," about a system I had used, successfully, for 50 years. I understood where it came from. I want to be fair about that, all the way through this story, because I think it's important. My children had lost their father suddenly and without warning, and the terror underneath their behavior was real and understandable. If it could happen to Dad with no notice, it could happen to Mom too, and they wanted, desperately, to have systems in place before it did. But understanding the fear behind a behavior doesn't make the behavior feel any less like a slow erosion of your own adulthood. About 2 years after Robert died, I noticed I'd started speaking to my own children in a slightly higher register, more agreeable, less direct, the way you might speak to someone you're trying to reassure. I realized one night doing dishes, actively managing my children's anxiety about me, at the cost of managing my own actual life. That's when I started to feel something underneath the grief. Not a replacement for it, something adjacent to it. A kind of low, persistent restlessness, like sitting in a waiting room for an appointment that was never going to be called. The dining room scene I opened with happened about 2.5 years after Robert's death. David had flown in from Minneapolis. He lived there with his wife, Renata, ostensibly for a regular visit, but I could tell within the first hour that something had been planned in advance, the way you can tell when your own children have rehearsed a conversation before having it with you. After dinner, David set a manila folder on the table. Inside was the durable power of attorney, drafted by an attorney I'd never met, on my behalf, without my ever having asked for one. "This isn't about right now, Mom," he said. "This is just responsible planning. If something happens and you can't make decisions, Renata and I want to be able to step in without a legal fight, without the courts getting involved. It protects everyone." Renata added, gently, "We just love you and we want to make sure you're taken care of." I looked at that document for a long time. I noticed the specific language. The document didn't just cover incapacity. There was a clause, which I'd later have a lawyer of my own explain to me in more detail, that as drafted would have given David fairly broad authority to make certain financial decisions on my behalf immediately upon signing, not contingent on any doctor's determination that I'd become incapacitated. I want to be careful here, because I don't believe David understood the full implications of what his attorney had drafted. I think he'd been handed a template and hadn't scrutinized it the way I eventually did. But that's exactly the point I want to make. My son had commissioned a document limiting my authority over my own life without ever once asking me what I actually wanted, or whether I felt I needed it. I told them I'd think about it. What I actually thought, driving them to the airport the next morning in total silence, was, "I am 71 years old. I have never once had a moment of cognitive concern flagged by any doctor, and my own children have decided, without consulting me, that the next chapter of my life needs to be managed by committee." That night, alone in the quiet house Robert and I built our whole life inside of, I did something I hadn't done in years. I poured a glass of wine, sat in Robert's old reading chair instead of my own, and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. If nobody was managing me, if nobody needed reassurance from me, if I had absolutely no one to answer to, what would I actually want to do with the years I had left? The answer didn't arrive as a country. It arrived, first, as a feeling, a specific hunger for somewhere warm, somewhere unfamiliar enough that no one there would have any preconceived idea of who I was supposed to be at 71. It started, oddly, through a former student. I'd taught high school English for 3 decades, and one of my former students, a woman named Priya, who was now in her 40s, had reached out on Facebook a few years back, the way former students sometimes do, and we'd stayed loosely in touch. She mentioned, in a message that fall, that her uncle had retired to a place called Dumaguete in the Philippines, and that she'd visited him the previous year, and it had completely rearranged her sense of what retirement could look like. I don't know why that particular message stuck with me the way it did, except that I think I was primed in a way I hadn't fully admitted to myself to hear it. I started reading. Quietly, the way I imagine people research things they're not ready to defend out loud yet. I read about the cost of living. I read about the Special Resident Retirees Visa, the SRRV, which the Philippine government offers to foreign retirees who meet certain deposit and income requirements, granting long-term residency without the visa-run gymnastics some other countries require. I read expat blogs, mostly written by men, I noticed, which made me specifically go looking for women's accounts, because I wanted to know what it actually looked like for a widow my age to do this alone, not accompanied by a husband managing the logistics. I found several. A woman named Carol Ann, originally from Tennessee, who'd been in Dumagate for 9 years and wrote candidly about the hard parts, the loneliness of the first 6 months, the frustration of the tourist visa renewal runs before she'd sorted her SRRV, the heat that never quite stopped being an adjustment even after years. But she also wrote about a market vendor who'd started saving her the best mangoes without being asked, and a Thursday mahjong game with 3 Filipino women in her neighborhood that had become the anchor of her week, and a doctor she trusted completely who charged her the equivalent of $18 for a full consultation. I read her entire blog archive over about 6 weeks, some nights until well past midnight. The way I used to read novels before grief had made sitting still with a book feel unbearable. I did not tell David or Amanda any of this. Given the power of attorney conversation, I understood, with total clarity, that if I mentioned Southeast Asia as even a hypothetical, it would confirm exactly the narrative they'd already built. That Mom's judgment needs supervising. So I kept researching in private, and about 4 months in, I booked a solo trip. 3 weeks. I told my children I was going on an extended trip with my church's women's group to visit some historic sites, a lie I am not proud of, but one I understood, even as I told it, as a direct consequence of having already been treated like someone whose plans required pre-approval. I flew out of Minneapolis in September, with a layover in Seoul, nearly 22 hours of total travel, landing at Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Manila in a state of exhaustion so complete that my usual anxieties simply had no fuel left to run on. The heat outside the airport was immediate and enveloping, thick in a way I'd read about, but hadn't quite believed until my own lungs confirmed it. The noise of Manila, jeepneys, motorbikes, vendors, horns, 1,000 small transactions happening simultaneously on every visible surface was overwhelming in a way that felt oddly like relief. Nobody here knew me as the widow whose children worried about her judgment. I was just another tired foreigner blinking in the heat. I spent 2 nights in Manila, mostly recovering, and then flew down to Dumaguete, a smaller regional flight that put me on the ground in under an hour. Dumaguete announced itself immediately as different from Manila's smaller, calmer, built around Silliman University, with a long waterfront boulevard, Rizal Boulevard, where the whole town seemed to gather in the evenings. I'd booked a small guest house a few blocks from the boulevard, run by a Filipino woman named Baby, an actual common nickname there, I'd learn, not an oddity, who was probably in her 60s and ran the place with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for decades. That first evening, jet-lagged and disoriented, I walked down to the boulevard as the sun began to set, and I sat on the seawall the way I'd read Carol Ann describe doing on her own first night, and I watched the whole town come out to walk, families, university students, old men playing chess at little tables, vendors selling grilled corn, and something called balut that I was not yet brave enough to try. Within about 10 minutes, a group of university students, noticing an obviously foreign older woman sitting alone, approached and asked, with a shyness I found completely disarming, whether they could practice their English with me. I spent nearly an hour talking with 5 19-year-olds about Minnesota winters and American television and whether I'd ever met anyone famous, and I laughed, genuinely laughed, the kind that comes from the diaphragm, for the first time in longer than I could accurately estimate. I sat there afterward, alone again, watching the boats out on the water catching the last of the light, and I thought, Nobody here has decided anything about what I'm capable of. I would have to prove I couldn't manage my own life before anyone here assumed it. I spent the remaining 2.5 weeks of that trip doing methodical, careful research, the exact kind of due diligence I want to point out that my children seemed to assume I was no longer capable of. I met with a Filipino attorney, recommended by another expat I'd connected with through an online forum, who specialized in the SRRV process and walked through the requirements in detail. A deposit of $10,000 into an accredited Philippine bank for retirees over 50, or a lower threshold with proof of a qualifying pension, along with health and background clearances. I toured 4 different rental properties before finding one I could imagine as a longer-term home, a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood called Piapi, a short tricycle ride from the boulevard, with a covered porch and a landlady, Mrs. Reyes, who lived next door and had rented similar units to 2 other foreign retirees over the years, references I could actually call. I visited Silliman University Medical Center, a private hospital with a strong regional reputation, walked through the outpatient department, asked detailed questions about costs for the kind of routine cardiac monitoring I need, given a mild arrhythmia I'd had for years, and got specific, satisfying answers, a cardiology consultation running around first 200 pesos, roughly $21. I met, through the university students I'd talked to that first evening, an older Filipina retired professor named Dr. Corazon Villarreal, who over coffee gave me an unusually candid rundown of what life as a foreign retiree actually looked like from the perspective of a longtime local resident, including a piece of advice I've thought about often since. Foreigners who come here and try to control everything the way they controlled things at home, they struggle. Foreigners who come and let the place teach them something, they stay forever. By the end of the 3 weeks, I hadn't signed a lease yet. But I'd stopped asking myself whether I could do this, and started asking myself only how quickly I could make it real. I flew home, and, for the second time in this story, made a decision privately before making it publicly. I sold the house within 7 weeks, a decision that, given the market at the time, moved faster than I expected, which meant the conversation with David and Amanda arrived faster than I'd mentally prepared for. Amanda found out first, driving up from St. Paul for what was supposed to be a routine visit, and seeing the realtor's sign in the yard before I'd had the chance to tell her myself. She didn't raise her voice initially. She stood in the driveway with her car door still open and said, very quietly, "Mom, what is happening?" I told her everything, in the driveway, standing there in October chill that already felt, to me, like something I was looking forward to leaving behind. The Philippines. The SRRV. The house in Piapi. All of it. She called David that evening, and within 4 days, both of my children were sitting at my kitchen table, the same table, I noted with a certain grim irony, where the power of attorney document had been laid out 11 months earlier. David led with practical objections, which was his pattern, the same pattern he'd used with the legal document. "Mom, do you understand the flight time from here to the Philippines? If something happens to you, we cannot get there quickly. There is no version of an emergency where we're on the ground within a day." Amanda was more direct, more emotional. "You lied to us about the church trip. You've been planning this whole thing behind our backs. Do you understand how that looks? It looks like you knew we'd say something, so you avoided telling us the truth." That last point landed, because it was accurate, and I told her so. "You're right, I did avoid telling you the truth, because 11 months ago you handed me a legal document assuming I could no longer be trusted to manage my own decisions, and I did not feel, after that I owed you advance notice of every plan I made." The room went quiet in a way that told me the comparison had actually registered. David, to his credit, was the one who eventually said, "Is this about the power of attorney?" "Yes," I said. "It's entirely about the power of attorney. You didn't ask me if I wanted one. You had a document drawn up and slid it across this table like it was already decided. And now I've made a decision about my own life, and I understand it feels like the same thing in reverse to you. But it isn't the same thing. I'm not asking either of you to sign anything. I'm telling you what I've already chosen." Amanda's eyes were wet. "We're not trying to control you, Mom. We're trying to keep you safe." "I know that's what you believe," I told her. "But I've spent 2.5 years having my competence quietly audited every time either of you visits, checking my pill organizer, checking my checkbook. I understand the fear it comes from, but I have spent 71 years capable of running my own life, and I am not going to spend whatever years I have left proving that fact on a weekly basis to my own children." The conversation ended, not in agreement but in something quieter, a kind of exhausted stalemate. David said, finally, "We're not going to stop worrying, Mom. That's not something we can just turn off." "I'm not asking you to stop worrying," I said. "I'm asking you to stop deciding." I moved into the house in Piapi in December, with 2 suitcases and a small shipping box of sentimental items, photographs, a few of Robert's books, the good china that had survived 4 decades of holidays. Mrs. Reyes, my landlady, met me at the gate with an umbrella against the afternoon rain and walked me through the house personally, though I'd already seen it on the previous trip, pointing out the water shut-off valve, explaining the quirks of the electrical panel, and then, before leaving, simply said, "You are not alone here. If you need anything, you knock." And she meant it literally. Over the following months, I knocked on that door more times than I can count, for things as small as a jar I couldn't open and as significant as help understanding a confusing electric bill. I built a rhythm over the following weeks that felt, for the first time since Robert died, entirely mine. Mornings on the covered porch with coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up. A twice-weekly visit to the public market, where a fish vendor named Nina began setting aside the best catch of the day for me once she learned my schedule. Afternoons at a small English tutoring program connected to a local church, working with children on reading comprehension, which felt, given my 31 years teaching English, less like volunteering and more like returning to the truest version of myself. I joined a Thursday mahjong group, exactly the kind Carol Ann had written about, 3 Filipina women in their 60s and 70s who'd been playing together for over a decade and folded me in with a warmth that startled me. One of them, a retired nurse named Faye, began calling me sister within the first month, unprompted, the way you'd address someone who'd simply always belonged. I want to be honest that the first 2 months were also lonely in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I'd wake some mornings with no immediate task, missing the specific comfort of a life built around another person's habits, the way Robert used to hum while making his own coffee 2 rooms away. That loneliness didn't disappear. It became one texture among several, rather than the only texture there was. Around the 5-month mark, something happened that I still find difficult to describe without my hands shaking slightly, even now. David called on a Tuesday, and his tone was different from our usual calls, careful, rehearsed, the way it had been the night of the power of attorney conversation. He explained that he and Amanda had consulted an elder law attorney back in Minnesota, and that, given my sudden and significant life changes, his words, combined with my age, they were exploring whether a guardianship petition might be appropriate. Not because they believed I was currently incapacitated, he clarified quickly, sensing my silence on the line, but as a protective measure in case anything happened while I was overseas, so that they could act on my behalf without what he called jurisdictional complications. I want to explain, for anyone unfamiliar with how this works, what that actually meant. A guardianship petition, if pursued and granted by a court, can result in a person losing significant legal authority over their own affairs, financial, medical, sometimes even where they're permitted to live, placed instead under the authority of a court-appointed guardian, who is very often a family member. It is not designed, and is not supposed to be used, as a tool to override the independent decisions of a competent adult that her family simply disagrees with. I sat on my porch after that call, the fish vendor's catch still sitting uncooked in my refrigerator, Fee's mahjong invitation for that Thursday still pinned to my little corkboard, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Robert's stroke, a genuine, cold fear, not of a place or a decision, but of my own children. I called Precha. No, that was Linda's attorney in the other story. Mine was a Filipino-American attorney named Marissa Fuentes, recommended through the Expat Network, who practiced partly in the Philippines and maintained relationships with elder law colleagues in the States. I explained everything. She was calm in a way that steadied me considerably. First, she said, a guardianship petition requires clear and convincing evidence of incapacity in most U.S. states, and she moved overseas and made decisions we disagreed with does not meet that bar on its own. Second, you need your own attorney in Minnesota immediately, not just me. Third, and I want you to actually hear this part, the existence of a threat like this, even an unsuccessful one, is something a court would want documented, because it speaks to intent. I hired a Minnesota elder law attorney the following week, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Okafor, who reviewed everything David had described and told me plainly that any petition filed on the basis described would face a very difficult time succeeding, provided I could demonstrate ongoing competence, which, she said, my own detailed, methodical planning of the move, the visa research, the medical due diligence, the rental references, all the things I'd done before ever signing a lease actually helped demonstrate rather than undermined. The tragic irony, Diane told me over a video call, is that the sheer thoroughness of your planning is exactly the evidence that would defeat a petition like this. You did your homework like someone entirely in command of her faculties. That's going to work in your favor, not against you. I want to tell you that the 3 weeks that followed, while Diane and Marissa worked in coordination, and I waited to see whether David and Amanda would actually file anything, were the darkest of this entire experience, darker, in their own way, than the early loneliness, darker than grief itself in a strange sense, because grief had never made me doubt whether my own children loved me appropriately. This did. I did not sleep well. I lost weight I didn't have to spare. Mrs. Reyes noticed and brought me soup one evening without being asked, sitting with me on the porch in a silence that said, without words, I am not going anywhere until you eat some of this. Fee, at that Thursday's mahjong game, noticed too, and when I finally told the group a version of what was happening, not every legal detail but the shape of it, one of the other women, a retired bank manager named Corazon, said something that has stayed with me since. In our family, when the elders get old, we do not take from them, we add to them. More people around the table, not fewer decisions in their hands. I am sorry your children were taught it the other way. The petition was never filed. What happened instead, 3 weeks after that initial call from David, was a different call, this one from Amanda, alone, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was a teenager. David told me what he was thinking about doing, she said. The guardianship thing. I didn't know until Diane's letter arrived at his house. He hadn't told me the full extent of it, just that he was looking into protective options. She paused for a long time. Mom, when I actually read what that would mean, When I understood what we'd actually be asking a court to do to you, I felt sick. I felt like we'd become people I don't recognize. I let the silence sit for a moment before responding, because I wanted her to sit in it too. I need you to understand something, I finally said. I am not confused. I am not incapacitated. I made every decision I've made in the last year with more careful research than I think either of you has made in a decade. And the thing that hurts the most isn't that you disagreed with my choice. It's that your first instinct, when you disagreed with me, was to look for a legal mechanism to override me, rather than a conversation to understand me. I know, she said. I know that now. I think we got so scared after Dad that we started treating your independence as the enemy instead of grief as the enemy. You didn't do anything wrong, Mom. You just kept being yourself, and we decided that was dangerous. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, the longest conversation Amanda and I had had in years, and by the end of it, something had genuinely shifted, not resolved entirely, not without scar tissue, but shifted. David called 2 days later, and his apology was harder won, more halting, the apology of a person who has to actually dismantle a story he'd told himself in order to give it. But he gave it. I think I convinced myself that loving you meant controlling the variables, he said. I don't think I ever asked myself what it would actually feel like, being on the other end of that. Amanda came 6 weeks later, alone, without David, which I understood as its own kind of message. She needed to see this for herself, without the buffer of doing it as a unified front with her brother. She landed skeptical and careful, watching everything with the specific vigilance of someone looking for evidence to support a story she'd already half written. I let her look. I didn't perform anything for her. I took her to the market, where Nina handed me the day's best catch without being asked and asked, in halting English, whether this was the daughter, and beamed when Amanda said yes. I took her to the tutoring program, where a 10-year-old named Davina proudly showed off a paragraph she'd written that I'd helped her revise the week before, and Amanda watched me work with the same patient attention I used to bring to my classroom in Duluth, decades ago, and something in her face changed, watching her mother be entirely, competently herself. I took her to Silliman University Medical Center, walked her through the cardiology department, introduced her to Dr. Reyes, no relation to my landlady, a common surname, who answered every one of Amanda's careful, detail-oriented questions with the specific, satisfying precision that seemed to genuinely surprise her. On her 4th evening, we sat on my porch with 2 glasses of the local rum, and Fee stopped by unannounced with a plate of biko, a sticky rice dessert, specifically because she'd heard my daughter was visiting, and the 3 of us sat together as the light went gold over the rooftops, and Amanda was quiet in a way that wasn't sadness. It was the particular quiet of someone recalculating. I thought you'd be isolated here, she finally said. I thought I'd get here and find you lonely and pretending you weren't. I am lonely sometimes, I told her honestly. That's true anywhere, at any age, and it would have been true in Duluth too, in that big quiet house. But I'm not isolated. I have people who notice if I don't show up somewhere. I don't think I've actually had that, since before your father passed. Before she flew home, standing at the departure gate, she said, I'm going to tell David everything, the real version, not just what I saw in photos. And Mom, I'm sorry. Not just for the guardianship thing. For the power of attorney too. I think that's where it actually started. I think we decided you were declining before you'd given us a single piece of actual evidence, and once we decided that, everything you did afterward just got filtered through it. I cried in the taxi on the way back from the airport. The good kind, the kind I'd been slowly getting more practice with over the past year. It has been 11 months since I sat at that dining room table in Minneapolis and looked at a legal document that assumed my competence was already something to be managed. I am not going to tell you this move solved everything, because that would not be honest. The relationship with David, in particular, is still rebuilding. We talk regularly now, and he visited for the first time 2 months ago, quieter and more watchful than Amanda had been, but it went well, and he left having apologized in his own halting way, and I believe him. Trust, once it's been shaken by something as serious as a guardianship threat, doesn't fully return on a fixed schedule. I've made peace with that being a slower process than I might prefer. I still miss things about my old life. I miss Minnesota winters in the specific, contradictory way you miss something that was also difficult. The particular silence of snow falling at night, the ritual of a fireplace in December. I miss having Amanda a reasonable drive away instead of a 20-hour flight. Those losses are real, and I hold them honestly. But here is what I have now that I did not have at that dining room table. I have a Thursday mahjong game with women who call me sister. I have a fish vendor who knows my preferences without my having to ask. I have a landlady who knocks on my door with soup when she notices I've gone quiet, and a tutoring program where I am, once again, simply a teacher, not a widow being monitored for signs of decline. I have, for the first time since Robert died, an adulthood that belongs entirely to me, researched, chosen, and defended, when it needed defending, by my own hand rather than a document someone else drafted on my behalf. If you are sitting somewhere right now, being handed a plan for your own remaining years by people who love you but have quietly decided that loving you means deciding for you, I want to tell you what I wish someone had told me at that table. Competence is not something you retain by asking permission. It's something you demonstrate by continuing to make your own decisions, carefully, thoroughly, and without apology, and letting the people who love you catch up to the truth of who you still are, in their own time, even when their own time is slower than you'd like. I'm 72 years old now. I did not sign that document. I signed a lease instead on a small house near a market in Dumagate, and some evenings, sitting on that porch with the boats coming in and Faye's laughter still hanging in the air from that afternoon's mahjong game, I think about the woman at that dining room table, staring at a pen someone else had already decided she should use. I want to reach back and tell her, put the pen down. You already know what you actually want. Go do that instead.